Thanks for joining us again for day 2 of the inaugural ITPro live event. Today we've heard from a long list of wonderful speakers, and we'd like to close out our day 2 speakers with the wonderful Amanda Brock, who will speak with us about the open source, how open source and open source standards are so fundamental in the continued health of the cloud. And following her presentation, we will have a Q&A session, so make sure you drop some questions down in the chat box right below you. And without further ado, I present Amanda Brock, CEO of OpenUK.
Thanks very much, Justin, and lovely to be with everybody this afternoon. Welcome to my kitchen. Not quite where I thought we were going to be talking together when Adam asked me to do this conference a good few months ago. However, I'm very pleased to be joining you this afternoon. I'm sorry I can't see you live, and I hope that perhaps later this year or next year we'll have an opportunity to meet up in a slightly different way. Do feel free after today's presentation, if there's anything that you want to talk to me more about and you don't have a chance in the Q&A, to follow up. My details are at the end. So this afternoon, I'm going to talk to you about it being open under the cloud. And let's just see, here we go. The system is working nicely. So as Kaylee said, I am the CEO at OpenUK, and OpenUK is an industry advocacy body which is pretty thought-leading and visionary in where it's going. And I'm not going to take credit for that myself. What I'm going to tell you about is our board. We have the most phenomenal board, one of whom I think John Laban is on the call this afternoon. And this board is absolutely visionary in what they're doing. I'll take credit for bringing them together and bringing together leaders in open source software, open hardware, and open data to come up with our strategy. And our vision as an organization is to develop and sustain UK leadership in open technology. That's a term you might not be overly familiar with, open technology, but it's something that I recommend you become familiar with because you're going to hear an awful lot more about it. And for us, open technology is open source software, open hardware, and open data. Now, the way that we're meeting that vision is that we are working in 3 distinct categories, 3 areas to bring it together. And those are community, legal and policy, and education. Now, the first of those, community, is very, very important to us. We have the most amazing community of people in open in the UK. But we have a small problem, and that problem isn't specific to the UK. It's one that we see geographically across the globe. People work in big international and global tech projects, open projects, which mean that they often collaborate with someone on the other side of the world, but don't know a neighbor or someone just down the street. If I'm absolutely honest, I had this experience during the pandemic where I met a lady who I'd been talking to for months who works at Microsoft. She literally lives 150 yards from me, and I had no idea. So what we're aiming to do is to bring that community together across projects and to build a cohesive, visible, and loud open community for the UK. I think it's something we'll see in other countries too, but Brexit really pushed that forward in the agenda for the UK, and it became absolutely critical for us to pull that community together. And we do it in different ways. We have newsletters, mailing lists, we have committees and work groups working on different projects, and we have events. Currently, we're taking nominations for the OpenUK Awards. The awards are now going to be digital, and it will be a very, very special digital event taking place on the 20th of October. Nominations are open until the 30th of June at openuk.uk/awards. And there are categories for individuals, a young person's category, and then for projects, organizations, and companies in open source software, hardware, or data. So please, if you know anybody you think deserves some recognition or a project based anywhere in the world but with a strong UK presence, please take some time out, very simple process, intentionally so, and nominate in our awards. The second piece is legal and policy. And what we want to do is influence the UK's legal and policy to make the UK a great place to do open. And that's actually been one of the easiest areas for us to establish ourselves in, because we have a number of the world's leading experts in legal and policy and open in the UK. It's made it very easy for us to establish this and to very quickly get credibility. By February, we had an invite to the UK international trade folk to go in and talk to them about the trade agreements they were negotiating post-Brexit. And frankly, they were looking for some guidance and some support on understanding how to deal with source provisions in those treaties. And obviously, with open source backgrounds, we understand that. But what we realized very quickly, it's one of those things that happens to you, right? You look up one day and you're old. And we looked around this group and suddenly everybody was in their 40s and 50s. And we were very, very conscious that we needed to bring on the next generation of those leaders in legal and policy. So we set up a future leaders group, and they are actively reviewing government terms across government procurement of technology, full stop, to see how those work for the open source elements and for open source generally, also hardware and data, so for the open technology provisions. Now, that activity will lead to a report, and hopefully they will be leading their own seminar with government in the autumn. And that's a big leap for some of these younger lawyers, policymakers, business people who are engaging in this process. We've already got 16 of them engaged, which I think is really good going for the time we've had. And we are actively mentoring them, but also providing training. So they have a future leaders training at noon every Friday. Different people from the UK and far, far beyond doing online training. Those are recorded. They're available on our website, in our events section, and our past events section for the recordings, and they will also be on YouTube shortly. Unsurprisingly, we review new laws and policy, and one of the things we're doing there is the Digital Services Act coming out of the European Commission. Very new piece of proposed legislation, dumping ground for many provisions, including the potential of a European cloud, it would seem. And we are engaging in that, and we're also engaging in projects like Gaia X away from the legislation side, so a German-led initiative to bring a European crowd starting in Germany and France. And in the next week or so, if you are following us in the press, you will see a joint report from our Legal and Policy Group and the Europe's Open Source Observatory, OSOR, on the state of open source in the UK. They've been doing that across all European countries, and we've collaborated with them on the UK's. Now, last but definitely not least for me is education. So we can have a community and we can lead in legal and policy, but we have to make sure that the education of the future generations of open technologists is taken care of. And we do that in a review of primary, secondary and tertiary education. If I start with tertiary, the pandemic has made that really difficult. Obviously, the universities have gone through turmoil. They're working out what they do. Not doing a lot at the moment, but I suspect that group will be very active again come the autumn. They were looking at student collaboration, sharing tools, and doing a 3-day training funded by Google's Posse project, Professors Open Source Software Education. That will now probably take place in 2021, if that's of interest. On the primary side, our plan has always been to engage with existing code camps that often teach kids to develop in an open way, but to encourage them to go a step further and to actually create an understanding of what that open way actually means. And then the third piece, the piece that we have been very, very focused on, is the secondary school area. We launched a competition, and I'm going to say I sweated blood over this competition at the beginning of the year. And we were engaged with the double Grammy Award-winning singer Imogen Heap, who invented something called the Maimu glove. And you can look up Imogen's TED Talk at CERN to see her perform with the Maimu glove or see her present the Grammys back in January. You can also see Ariana Grande, who uses Imogen's glove and toured with it. I think 2015, I saw her tour with it. So it's one of those things, one of those pieces of tech that is very, very relatable for kids, particularly girls. And last year, back in April 2019, the Maimu team who create the glove came out with the Minimu glove kit. So what we'd arranged was for 100 of those kits to be distributed to schools across the UK to compete against each other, and to bring 5 regional finals teams of 4 kids to London with adults, and to have a day in Red Hat's labs, because Red Hat have very kindly sponsored this with some additional help from GitHub. And for them to spend the day with Imogen, which was an amazingly kind gesture on her part. Now, 2020 is not the year to be moving kids across the country, and it's not the year to ask a kid to share a glove with another. So we had to totally regroup, as many people have had to do over the last few months. Instead, what we've done is we've carried on with our competition. It takes place in September. Registrations are now closed, and we have 47 schools participating. I can't say that it's the 100 we were hoping for, but I'm not disappointed. I think it's an amazing achievement for us to have got 47 schools in the pandemic to commit to take part in this, and they will be competing in September. Obviously, there are prizes at stake, but what we've done is we've repurposed a lot of the funding that was going to go into the travel arrangements for the kids, bringing them to London, and we've come up with something that I think is going to be really important. We've created a 10-episode animation, and each episode is a learning experience. Imogen Heat very kindly narrates the first one for us. It teaches you how to use the glove. Then you go through another 9 weeks of fun animations where you're learning how to do different activities with the glove and to expand your creativity around tech. The lessons will help those kids to learn how to use the gloves before they compete. But importantly, it's currently being run in a closed environment as something that is a trial for us, because in about a week's time, we'll be announcing a major kids summer camp, a digital summer camp, which will involve those 10 episodes being shown through August over a 5-week period, 2 episodes a week. And the digital camp will allow kids to interact. We will be distributing, I believe, 3,000 kits, mini kits, not quite the one you see here, for free with a partner across the UK. So watch this space to see us doing our best in the education space. And the final thing I'm going to say to you about OpenUK, because I know you really want me to talk about cloud today, is ditto, develop in the open. This is an open healthcare project that we're involved with, which is creating an EOBS system for the NHS, which will be something that will be shareable on a free and open source license at no cost across the NHS. Now, like many people in open source, I don't just have one job. I'm also a European rep for the Open Invention Network, OIN. And OIN is the biggest defensive IP organization in history. It's a patent pool. Everybody who signs up signs the same document, the same license. They commit to the same thing, which is to cross-license their patents. So any patents they hold, you don't have to hold patents to sign up, but if you do, any patents you hold, you commit to license those to everybody else in the group, and they will do the same back to you. And you license them to the extent that they read on the Linux system definition. Now that Linux system definition is over 2,800 packages. So if your patent applies to one of those, you'll give a license to the others. It costs nothing to participate, and if you are either using, distributing, or creating open source software and you're not in OIN, you ought to be. It is part of the good governance, the good housekeeping of open source. I've got a couple more jobs that I'll just mention. I'm on a number of advisory boards. I chair this one, the UN's Technology Innovation Labs, Open Source and IP Advisory. So we help the various projects across the 4 labs, soon I believe to be 10 labs, with their intellectual property. I'm also on a number of non-commercial boards, a number of open source boards like the OASIS Open Projects one. You may be familiar with OASIS as an open standards body. And also with some commercial entities like Ballmer, I sit on their advisory board. And the final little project I'm going to mention is Open Tech Response. Now, you guys all work in cloud, you work in tech, you will have seen the tech sector's amazing response to the pandemic, something we should all be really proud of. And it's no surprise to me that folk in open source wanted to do something. They wanted to do something and do it quickly. What that meant was we saw many, many people coming up with the same ideas across the globe, and there was no way for them to find each other or connect with each other. So we spun out Open Tech Response, which is primarily a Slack channel with an open source Rocket interface. So if you're an open source purist, you can use Rocket. And that allows different projects to make others aware of their existence. It has some key figures from the open communities who can help with things like funding on there. It also is associated with a new piece of tech that we have just launched, which is a database matchmaking service. So we're building a database of these projects and matching projects with volunteers who would like to help, whether that's help developing, documentation, governance, whatever it happens to be. And actually, this wasn't anything to do with me. A chap called Patrick at DataStat, Patrick McFadden, who came up with the fact that we shouldn't just build this as a knee-jerk to COVID. We should build it as something that can be utilised going forwards. Sadly, there are bound to be other disasters, and Open Tech Response is there to help with those. I also, for my sins, I'm editing a book. And I'm editing a book on law and policy and open source. The title is Free and Open Source Law, Policy and Practice. I know it rocks, but it says what it does on the tin. For the first edition, which was almost 10 years ago, I wrote a chapter on business models. And that's very relevant to what we're going to talk about today. For my chapter, what I'm aware of is that I had to go back to the drawing board. Some of the other authors have had a much easier time. The last decade, it won't have escaped you that everything about technology has changed. The way that we work, what we're doing, the tools that we use have all been completely transformed by the platform and cloud environment. Now, I will say that this book will be published early next year. It's published by Oxford University Press, but I'm very proud to say that the Veitch Foundation have sponsored it so that we're able to make it open access, and it will be freely downloadable by anybody who wants to read it from January, February next year. And I guess the last thing that I do in my day-to-day existence is this. I spend a lot of time currently talking to a screen, often joined by a small cat, but generally going to conferences and talking to people about open and meeting all sorts of really interesting folk all over the globe and writing about open. So how did a nice girl like me end up in a space like this? Well, early in 2008, I joined a company called Canonical. I worked as a lawyer for 25 years, and I would have been about 15 years in 2008 when I joined Canonical, maybe a little bit more. I imagine most of you have heard of Canonical. It's the commercial entity, the commercial sponsor of the Ubuntu operating system. And Ubuntu is very much the operating system of choice for the development community. And when I joined back then in 2008, as I said already, the world was a very different place. And what we saw then was an environment where we were focused on the desktop, we were focused on the enterprise. Obviously, cloud was just a developing new thing, containers, etc., hadn't been created then. And we had a very clear licensing model in Canonical for Ubuntu, which was that Ubuntu was freely licensed on an open source license and always was and always would be free. And I'm going to quote you something that the founder said. Mark Shuttleworth, who I worked very closely with for a long time and have a great deal of respect for, Mark describes being in an open source company and developing open source as enabling your own competition with the benefit of your invention. And he goes on to say in a podcast that I'm quoting from, an open source Underdogs podcast, that it can be financially and emotionally draining. I think that was a very brave thing and a very vulnerable thing for Mark to admit to. Now, if you didn't know Canonical, I can guarantee that you will know this one, Red Hat. Red Hat was sold almost exactly a year ago to IBM, a price of $34 billion. I'm sure every single person on this call or who watches this and download will know exactly who Red Hat is. Big presence in the UK. And Red Hat works in a slightly different operating model. Red Hat's model is around subscription. So RHEL, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, is sold through subscription. The software itself is free, but the packaging is available, the support services, indemnity come as a bundle through subscription. And they've worked on that basis for about 20 years, building that business. In fact, I think it's almost exactly 20 years. Now, Red Hat is very definitely a unicorn. And they're a unicorn because of their valuation. There is no doubting that. 34 billion, well over the billion. But I and many others in open source have wondered whether or not they're a double unicorn. No, not two horns, but whether they're a double unicorn because they have a model that isn't replicable. They're the mythical beast. And that's something that we'll see as time develops and others try to follow them in their subscription model. Questionably, arguably, they have a very particular product, and their product involves them being very close to the Linux kernel. They're major contributors to the kernel. And also they started this 20 years ago, and that model for them has managed to sustain through the transition. But they started it at a moment in time, which is a very different time from today. Now, before I go on to any more slides, I've talked to you about two open source companies that you'll recognize, I hope. But I haven't really talked about what open source is. Now, what I'm going to say to you firstly is that open source is not a business model. I repeat, open source is not a business model. It is many other things, but it is not a business model. It is a collaborative development model. It is a license format, a way of doing licensing. An open source license is one that's approved by the Open Source Initiative that complies with the OSD, the open source definition. Generally, open source software will be distributed on those licenses royalty-free. And you could even say that it's a social and political movement or the future, but it is definitely not a business model. So if I go back to Canonical and Red Hat, another thing that Mark would say about open source is that it can't be understood by looking backwards. You can't understand open source by looking through the lens of the past. And the reason for that is that the past in tech is very analog. Software and ownership in software was held by very few companies. If you look digitally and you look forward, you're looking at a different environment where software belongs to the many. That's been hugely impacted through digital transformation, or it has caused digital transformation, depending on which way you want to look at it. Another thing that's caused digital transformation for those who were the very reluctant and the very slow has indeed been the pandemic. The final heel draggers have been pulled into the digital world. And what we've seen is that many, many companies are driving to the same goals. Everybody is working on the basis that their products are either created, distributed, or utilized using digital technology. We're all going to agree on that. Nobody's going to argue with that. So they all have the same needs. And that inevitably has smart people understanding that this is the age of collaboration. Many eyes make better software, make better hardware. Many eyes is the future of technology. So some of you will know this, OpenStack. I'm just going to take a second to think about cloud and the transition that we made into cloud. So back in my days at Canonical, I worked with a chap called Simon Wardley, and Simon was the director of cloud at Canonical. If you have Simon speak, he's based on the south coast of England, and he is one of the best speakers that you are ever going to hear. He's an amazing guy. And I would highly recommend that you find one of his talks and listen to them. And when we were working together, Simon drove the Ubuntu story in the cloud and drove it to Ubuntu having 76% of the cloud marketplace almost overnight. It was an amazing feat. Remember, though, that Canonical was not on a subscription model like Red Hat, that we were giving away the software and then relying on another model that's used in open source, a support model. And that subscription and support models are often categorized together, but they're actually very different. And those rely on the need for implementation, add-on services, maintenance coming from the supplier of the software. And as the supplier of the software, you rely on your own knowledge and excellence to be the one who's chosen to do that. However, once your code is released, if it doesn't need all of that, it's released and it can be used. And that was a big lesson for us back in the day at Canonical. And it's something that I think probably helped to shape Mark's view that it can be financially and emotionally draining to be creating open source software in a commercial space. And remember with the licenses that generally, they don't have to be, but generally open source licenses are royalty free. Now, if you think about the models I've described, that doesn't mean that open source software historically was free. There was a total cost to ownership. 10 years ago, that was the economic model that everybody was looking at. You would roll in various costs of implementation, support, maintenance to get that total cost of ownership. Formulas for it were being developed. Now, clearly, when we look at a platform economy, the cloud economy that you operate in, that doesn't really work anymore. And there's a lot of work going on in the background now, looking at total cost of enterprise or total cost to enterprise, working out how we should define that, what it means. Is it the cost of all the code that sits underneath the cloud, all the open source infrastructure that you will benefit from? Or is it something like the actual benefit to society and the profit made from it all? So there are different economic theories working around that. And I hope I'll have the opportunity to talk to you more about where that's going probably later this year. But keep that thought in your mind. Keep the open source business models, keep the licensing that's royalty free, and keep the sort of economic conditions, the things that we're working out about open in your mind as we go through my talk. So when I left Canonical, I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew I wanted to work in open. I didn't want to move to the States, and there weren't really many opportunities in Europe back in 2012-13 in open. So I decided to join a very forward-looking, progressive law firm, a small law firm that was also an IP strategy shop. They even had a Labrador in the office, Scout, who I'm very fond of. So in that role, I came up with my own little theory that I worked with when I had new clients come in. And as the ex-GC of Canonical, I had many, many clients come to me saying, I've got this brilliant idea, I want to create an open source business. And I would explain to them, as I'm explaining to you, that open source is not a business model. And they would nod and they would agree, and they would still say they wanted to set up an open source business. So what I took to was what if? What if you set up an open source business and you release all your code open source and other people use it? Generally, they were okay with that. What if you release it and somebody else makes a lot of money out of that? And, by this stage, noses would be wrinkling, there'd be a little bit of confusion or alarm. And then the third what if? What if somebody else takes your code and they make a huge amount of money out of it? They don't have to share it with you, and you don't make anything. Now, you won't be surprised to know that many of the people who came to me after my what if decided they didn't want to set up open source businesses. It wasn't for them. They were very clear that they were trying to do the right thing, but they wanted to create something that they knew was theirs, they could control, and other people couldn't profit from. Now, my what if doesn't mean that there isn't money to be made in open. Look all around you and you will see huge, huge companies, small companies, foundations, organizations making billions of dollars out of open source. And we'll see more of that in a few minutes. But as you know, cloud for the last decade has very much been at the heart of open source, and open source is at the heart of cloud. OpenStack was one of the first pieces of very clear public collaboration in open source, creating something quite special at its time. I was very proud to have been part of the OpenStack Foundation's drafting committee. We set up the infrastructure for the organization, and we worked collaboratively across the legal teams from all the different founders, and Canonical was a founder member. So although, and bear in mind what I said to you about the cloud marketplace and Canonical Ubuntu taking 76% of it, that's Simon's figure, so it's going to be approximately right. Despite that, we were able to compete vehemently on deals and contracts, yet come together and work and collaborate on a project. And we saw people, not just the lawyers, business people, technology people across OpenStack, from Dell and HP, from ARM and Intel, collaborating together. Now, obviously, you need to manage competition and antitrust and have a robust policy to do that. But what you're doing is you're creating a de facto standard, a base, a cost-efficient way of creating technology, whether it's software or hardware, that allows a collaboration to create the best standard elements of the technology that you're happy to share. Low down the stack, maybe, where you don't need to differentiate yourself, allowing yourself to go further up and make your money differentiating yourself. And that collaboration, without a doubt, creates better software, better code. So time has passed since 2012. Even I've noticed that. And what we see is the likes these days of the Linux Foundation's collaboration. Linux Foundation has a number of collaborations, one being CNCF. The director, or one of the directors at CNCF, Cheryl Hung, is based here in London, and actually she's one of the judges of our awards. So if you have cloud open source, Cheryl knows a lot about it and will be judging entries. Again, encourage you to enter. The reason I picked this up here is very loosely to give you an indication. There's over 300 different brands when you scroll through this, which are open source. There's a market capitalization that, even when you pick out any proprietary components, is in the trillions. And there's funding in the billions. So the cloud infrastructure around open source, the open source infrastructure around cloud is phenomenal. It's huge. It's undeniable. I picked half a dozen logos. I haven't even put the Kubernetes name beside it. You obviously know Kubernetes. There is no doubting that. I was supposed to be in KubeCon in Amsterdam back in early April, end of March. Sadly cancelled, but that event is as big these days as the open source summit that the Linux Foundation organise around Linux. You know, the place of open source in cloud is undeniable. But what we've also seen is that one of the many advantages of open is the adoption. So if you're a company and you want people to use your code, making it open in a Git economy is a great thing to do. If you use GitHub, GitLab, whatever you're using as your repo, it allows a rapid adoption across many, many entities, and it allows tech people, CTOs, CIOs, to go along and pick things as they get popular, to bring them into their organizations without the normal procurement processes, to use them without cost, and to kick the tires, to work out whether or not it's going to be right for them. And that's a huge advantage to small providers who are building their product, as well as to the companies using them. And we've seen many companies build amazing software, but what we've seen also is some who may not have understood my what if scenario. Perhaps they didn't find an old Canonical lawyer who was able to talk to them about it. And we've seen something that I would refer to as the open core wars. Now, another business model around open source is open core, where you have open at the heart of it, and then you have other software which is proprietary that you can distribute at a cost on a royalty paying license, not an open source license. And that open core model is something that a number of companies have flipped in and out of. One of them was Redis Labs, who felt that their code was being taken by some of the cloud companies and in a way that made their business model unsustainable. Maybe they didn't know the what ifs when they set it up. There is an excuse for not knowing the what ifs, of course. So I think it's one of the HashiCorp founders that I listened to in a podcast who beautifully explained that they'd set up this project without any conception that it was going to become a business. And if that happens, of course, you haven't thought through the business model. But these days, for anybody setting up open source as a project and as it starts to gain traction, it's something that they generally are going to be cognizant of. And what Redis did was have a clause drafted called the Commons Clause, which restricted usage of the open source so that the cloud providers couldn't compete with it. Now, the Commons Clause is a problem. It was a huge problem. It has very little adoption because it was a huge problem. It's vilified generally by the open source community, and it attaches a clause to the Apache license, which has the effect actually of stopping it being open source. It says at the very last line, it's best not to call Commons Clause software open source. It's not best not to. You can't. It's not open source. And that's caused a lot of confusion and turmoil. But it's also understandable for organizations as they start to understand what can be done with their code. Another instance of these open core wars, which really started, I think, around 2017, is Elastic. And Elastic had a disagreement with Amazon, who forked the Elasticsearch project and distributed it directly through its cloud services using the Elastic name. And Elastic had to accept the licensing, that the open source licensing allowed this. Talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But Elastic also have pursued trademark litigation against Amazon, which we should really have a result for by now. But again, pandemic, that's been pushed back to the autumn. Different companies are dealing with this in different ways. And what we saw in 2019 was Google collaborating through Google Cloud with I think 7 companies initially. I don't know if there are more today, where what it did was agree with those companies that the bundling of their code into a paid for service on Google would be recompensed or rewarded. And those companies get to share in the profits. Sometimes you'll hear the phrase strip mining used, and strip mining is a term that's used where cloud providers are seen to be reaping benefits without giving back to the open source community. A bit like my what ifs. So Google was finding a way to collaborate with the open source companies to stop that happening. And 7 is a good start. I'm sure it has been expanded, but I would need to check. But trying to scale that is something that could obviously be very difficult. What we also saw was this becoming a mainstream issue. And I think December, could have been end of November, but December 2019, the New York Times published this article about strip mining, accused AWS of strip mining, not specifically open source, although open source and the open source licensing is what's at the heart of this discussion. It was a surprise to me to see such a clear discussion of open source in the piece. I would recommend you reading it. And unsurprisingly, of course, AWS has responded to that, because AWS taking code that's licensed open source is not doing anything wrong. The license is allowed for that, at least in terms of licensing. Morally, ethically, business-wise, different story perhaps, and that's something that's very debatable. But unsurprisingly, AWS responded with a piece, a blog by Andy Gutmans, who has a lot of credibility in the open source community. You'll see from this, I wanted to flag that. And if you're interested in hearing more about the different open source companies involved, how they've reacted to that, there's a brilliant series of podcasts called Open Source Underdogs. And I think there's something like 48 episodes before Mike Schwartz, who created it, get called it a day. He's now working on a different podcast. But these two in particular are two that I like, because James and Shannon are really positive at Pivotal now, VMware and Rancher, about their ability to make money around open source by having the right products and the right relationships. So, you know, it's not a lost cause. Many companies are, in fact, doing very well out of it. This week, I engaged with a chap called Andy Oram on LinkedIn. Actually, you can follow our conversation if you look for us. Andy wanted to flag this closed core model to me. And Andy is somebody who's written about open source for almost 30 years at O'Reilly. So he really knows the ins and outs. And he was talking about the interactions of the likes of Google with the open source community. Not quite the piece I've talked to you about from April 2019 with the good citizenship and revenue sharing, but actually closed core, and whether or not that could be the future. And what he means by that, in short, is that companies like Facebook, like Google, often share their code, but the core code is closed, but they will share open source that they don't feel they need to differentiate themselves. And if I remember rightly, that's where Kubernetes started from Google sharing. So why does all this matter? Well, I would tell you, and I'm sure Linus would tell you, and many others in the open source space would tell you, that it's really, really important that we have a healthy ecosystem around open. I'm hoping that we will have a chance to come and talk to you about open hardware and the combination of hardware, software, and data to create the future ecosystem around platform economy. But just focusing today as we are on software, of course we would tell you it's better that it's open, and of course we would tell you to do things to make sure that that open infrastructure survives. But don't take it from me. So this is Steve Wally, a good friend of mine, and Sasha Nadal. Steve has worked at Microsoft twice, and in his current tour at Microsoft, he gave a keynote in Edinburgh in October 2018. And he gave that keynote because Microsoft, after 9 years of discussion with OIN, had decided to become a licensee and to commit its patents to the Open Invention network. By doing so, it shared its patents with over 3,000 other licensees of OIN. You'll remember my earlier slide. And Steve was giving this keynote about Microsoft's journey to open source. Now, I'm sure many of you are technologists who remember Steve Ballmer and his opinion of open source. I think the word that he used to describe open source was that it was a cancer. So look at this slide. Steve's in a conference venue in Edinburgh that is huge. There are thousands of people in this audience, and that is an absolutely enormous backdrop with Sasha Nadal. And what Sasha says is, judge us by the actions we've taken in the recent past, our actions today and in the future. Mark Shuttleworth's forward-looking digital lens, not your past analog lens. Now, Steve very eloquently explains this and explains that it's based on 3 reasons. If you're interested in Steve, this is, I think, 13 minutes long as a keynote. It's a brilliant keynote, and it's definitely worth listening to. Steve also has a number of, if you look from on YouTube, a number of discussions around business models and open source that are very influential and worth listening to. Steve explains that there are 3 reasons that Microsoft have gone on this journey. 3 reasons why, at least if you look at GitHub, they're the biggest single contributor of lines of open source code in the world today. And the first of those is that 10 years ago, customers didn't ask for open source, and today they do. Makes sense. Second reason is cloud. Now, you might have heard of it. Microsoft has something called Azure. It's a cloud platform. And what Steve says is that to work in cloud, to have Azure, to build any cloud platform, you have to be able to build it on the open source infrastructure that sits under the cloud. And to do that, you have to understand that, you have to learn to code it, you have to have the right people in place. So to have a cloud business, Microsoft has had to engage with the open source community and with open source software. And then his third reason is that the development community, the best developers today, are open source. If you think about it, anybody born after 1989 was born after the Linux kernel. And being born after the Linux kernel, you've grown up with that as a norm, which means that you expect to be able to collaborate, you expect to be able to work in an open way. So to attract the best developers, companies like Microsoft that are on a journey, and I would suggest that all companies going through digital transformation, all companies learning to use open, which you have to be in the cloud business, are on that digital journey and need to learn from Microsoft's example. So don't listen to me, listen to Microsoft. And in conclusion, I want to leave you with sort of 3 thoughts here. The first one is about code. So if you are going to think about being in cloud, if you are in cloud, if you are in a platform business, then I'm going to suggest to you that you should look at the code that sits underneath your business and acknowledge and accept that it's open, and understand that for that to survive, for the entrepreneurs of the next generation to come forward, that needs to be cherished and nurtured and encouraged, and we have to find ways for you to contribute, whether that's financially or in code, to that. The second thing I'm going to say to you is, if you don't already collaborate, then you should be. You should be participating in some of these projects. You may not feel at first that you're an expert, but you can go in and find your way. Generally, collaborative communities are very, very encouraging and tolerant of that. And my third one doesn't have a slide. My third one is the cloud. Now, I believe Eric Schmidt is credited with coming up with the word cloud back in 2011. I look above me today in London and there's a clear blue sky and no clouds. But if there was a cloud in the sky, what would it do? Well, it might block out the sun, but it's also going to produce things like rain, sleet, snow. And if I'm unlucky, and if things go wrong and they're bad, it could produce so much rain, so much snow that I'm in a monsoon type situation and everything underneath the cloud is washed away. Now, I'm going to suggest to you in my parting shot, please don't let that happen to the infrastructure that you're working with. Help us to help you to build a better cloud using open source.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda. That was tons of great information about open and how it can support the cloud moving forward. We do have a couple of questions for you. We have a few minutes. We'll probably only do a few here. The first one I have is, how can companies ensure they're continuing to support and contribute to the open source community in an effective way?
Yeah, I think there's lots of different ways that you can contribute. Depending on what you're using in your cloud environment, obviously find out what's there, find out what infrastructure you're built on, engage, join the foundations, join the projects, financially contribute, make sure that you're using, even if you're complying with the letter of the license, you're using using open infrastructure in the cloud in a fair way, and just spend a little bit of time exploring what's there and getting to know that community. If you feel that you're adding enhancements to the cloud infrastructure that can be shared, maybe you also want to share those and add them to existing projects.
Perfect. And one final one, in your view, what are the most important open source projects that are currently being worked on today?
That's a really unfair question. If I answer that and I don't mention the hundreds and thousands of projects, somebody is not going to be speaking to me. I'm going to pick one rather than miss many, and I'm going to say Kubernetes.